The ceremonial blade caught the torchlight and turned it the color of old rust, and Thomas Lockhart held his open palm beneath it without letting his hand shake, though every instinct screaming in his chest told him to run. Around him, the Fireblood clan stood in a wide ring on the flattened crown of the plateau, hundreds of orcs in hide and leather and beaten iron, their faces lit gold and orange by torch fire, the great windmills turning slow and silent at their backs against a sky gone the deep purple of a bruise. The matriarch Yash Fireblood stood before him with the ancient dagger called the Oathblade balanced across both her palms, its iron pitted with age, its hilt wrapped in a strip of leather so old it had gone black. Somewhere behind her, chains of grain sacks waited to be blessed or burned, depending on what the blade decided about the man kneeling in the dirt. "You carry the name of the man who broke faith with my grandmother's grandmother," Yash said, and her voice did not rise, which was somehow worse than shouting. "Blood remembers, Thomas Lockhart, even when men forget. Tonight the blade will ask your blood what your mouth cannot be trusted to answer." Thomas kept his eyes forward. His right arm still ached beneath its bandages from the wound he had taken 3 days before, the wound that had put him in this circle at all, but he did not let the pain show on his face. He had promised himself that much. Then, before the blade could fall, a hand closed around Yash's wrist. "No," Yash Fireblood said. The whole plateau seemed to hold its breath. Yash stood tall and furious beside her mother, war paint smeared beneath her eyes from 3 days of grief and vigil at Thomas's bedside, her leather armor still scored from the fight that had nearly killed them both. She did not look at the crowd. She looked only at the blade, and then, with a motion too fast for anyone to stop, she drew her own belt knife across her palm instead, opening a clean red line from the base of her thumb to the edge of her wrist, and thrust her bleeding hand into the ceremonial bowl at her mother's feet. "If blood must answer for him," she said, loud enough now that it carried to the last row of watching clanfolk, "then it will be mine. I stake my name on his heart. Let the old blade judge me if it must judge anyone." It would take a long telling to explain how a mountain hunter with no family left and no home, but the deep wild had come to kneel on a sacred plateau with the daughter of a chieftain's line bleeding for him in front of 500 witnesses. But it began, as so many things in that hard country did, with wolves and grain and a woman who was not afraid of anything at all. Thomas Lockhart had been tracking the pack for 6 days before he ever laid eyes on Yash Fireblood. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders from years of hauling traps and hides through timber country, with sun-browned skin and a quiet, watchful way about him that made most people in Millhaven forget he was in the room until they needed him. He had no wife, no children, no kin closer than a cousin 2 provinces east he had not spoken to in a decade. His mother and father had died of the winter fever when he was 19. And since then he had made his living the way men like him always did along the border country, hunting what needed hunting, tracking what needed tracked, and keeping mostly to himself in a cabin an hour's walk from town, at the edge of the deep wild where the mountains climbed up toward the sky. That autumn a pack of dire wolves, driven down from the high passes by an early snow, had taken to hunting the wagon roads that wound up onto the Goldrun Plateau, the great tableland of golden wheat and barley that fed both Millhaven and the orc clans who lived along its northern rim. The plateau was crowned with 7 windmills, ancient wooden giants with sailcloth wings that turned day and night grinding grain for both peoples, standing as they had for 3 generations since the grain accord had ended the last true war between humans and orcs. It was strange, sacred ground, shared by treaty and guarded jealously by both sides, and lately it had not been safe to travel. The town council of Millhaven had offered a bounty for the wolves, and Thomas, needing the coin and knowing the high trails better than any man for 50 miles, had taken the job without much thought for what waited at the top of the ridge road. What waited was Yash Fireblood, up to her elbows in wolf blood, fighting for her life. He came around the last switchback in the road just as the sun cleared the eastern rim of the plateau, and the light hit her like something out of an old story. She stood atop an overturned grain wagon, thigh-high boots of dark leather laced to the knee, fitted war leathers that hugged the powerful lines of her body, and left her strong arms bare to the cold morning air. A wide belt at her waist studded with iron and hung with two curved short swords, one of which was currently buried to the hilt in the throat of a wolf twice the size of any Thomas had ever hunted. Her black hair was pulled back in a thick braid threaded with small iron beads that caught the light when she moved, and her tusks, small and neat and gleaming white, showed when she snarled at the two wolves still circling her, driving them back with a swing of her second blade. She was, without question, the most magnificent thing Thomas Lockhart had ever seen, and she was about to be pulled down by 4 more wolves closing in from the tree line behind her, unseen, because her attention was fixed entirely on the two in front. He did not think. He nocked an arrow, put it through the lead wolf's eye at 40 yards while still moving at a dead run, and was already reloading before the animal hit the ground. Yash spun at the sound, saw the wolves coming up behind her, and for one heartbeat their eyes met across the wreckage of the wagon and the scattered grain and the blood soaking into the dirt. Then she was moving again, dropping from the wagon to meet the charge with a roar that shook loose snow from the nearest pine boughs, and Thomas was beside her, knife in one hand and bow slung across his back, putting himself at her flank without being asked. They fought together for less than 2 minutes, though it felt far longer, and when it was done 6 wolves lay dead around the ruined wagon and Thomas Lockhart stood with his knife still dripping, breathing hard, staring at the orc woman who was staring right back at him with an expression he could not read. "You should not have come alone," she said. Her voice was low and rough, accented in the way of the clans, each word given its full weight. "Neither should you," he said. Something flickered at the corner of her mouth that might have been the start of a smile, though she killed it before it could fully form. "I am Yash Fireblood. This grain was bound for the mill at First Sister. Now half of it is in the mud." "Thomas Lockhart," he said, "I was hired to deal with the wolves. Looks like you started without me." "I do not wait for hired men," she said, and sheathed both her blades in one smooth motion. "But I will not pretend your arrow did not save me from a wolf I did not see. That is worth acknowledging, human. It was not gratitude exactly, not yet. But it was the first thread of something, and Thomas felt it pull tight in his chest, even as he told himself not to be a fool about an orc woman who could break him in half without trying. Word of the fight at the Ridge Road spread fast through both Millhaven and the Fireblood camp, and within a week, the town council and the clan matriarch had reached an arrangement neither side much liked but both needed. Thomas Lockhart, who knew the deep wild trails better than any man alive, and had proven he would put himself between an orc woman and a wolf's teeth without hesitation, would serve as scout and guard along the grain roads, working directly under whichever warband the matriarch assigned to plateau patrol. That warband, as it happened, was Yash's own. She did not thank him for the arrangement. She barely spoke to him the first week, riding ahead of him on patrol with her jaw set and her eyes forward, answering his questions in clipped, short sentences, as though every word cost her something. But Thomas was a patient man, the kind who could sit motionless in a blind for 6 hours waiting for a deer to wander close, and he did not push. He simply did his work well, tracked what needed tracking, found the places where the fence lines had been cut and the grain stores had been raided, and let her see, day after day, that he was exactly as steady as he seemed. It was at the autumn market fair in Millhaven, held in the town square beneath strings of dried corn and the smell of roasting meat, that the first real spark between them caught and held. Thomas had come to trade hides and had not expected to see Yash there at all, since few clanfolk came down into the human town, even during the fair, old wounds from the war still too raw for most. But she came anyway, drawn by curiosity or something else she did not name, dressed in the same fitted travel leathers she always wore on patrol. The laces at her throat pulled loose enough to show the strong line of her collarbone, and her presence turned every head in the square. Some of those looks were hostile. An old man spat in the dirt near her boots and muttered something about the war under his breath. A mother pulled her children back against a stall wall as though Yash might lunge for them. Thomas saw all of it, saw the way Yash's spine went rigid and her chin lifted higher with every unkind glance, refusing to let any of them see it land, and something hot and protective rose up in him that he had not felt in a very long time. He crossed the square and fell into step beside her before he had quite decided to do it. "They stare because they are fools," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear. "They stare because their fathers told them stories about mine," Yash said. "I do not need defending Thomas Lockhart." "I did not say you did." He nodded toward a stall selling spiced cider. "I said they were fools. There is cider that will not poison you if you have never had it. My treat, since you saved my life at the Ridge Road and I have never properly paid the debt. You saved mine first. Then we are square and this is simply cider." That got the smile out of her at last, small and reluctant and devastating, and Thomas felt it land somewhere behind his ribs like an arrow finding its mark. They had not gotten 3 steps toward the cider stall before a young woman with honey-colored curls and a dress the color of ripe wheat stepped directly into Thomas's path, all bright eyes and practiced charm. "Thomas Lockhart," she said, "I have not seen you at the fair in an age. You must come see my father's stall. He has the finest wool in the province, and I am sure a man of your build could use a proper coat before winter." "Elsie," Thomas said, polite but distant. "Maybe later." But Elsie's gaze had already slid sideways to Yash, taking in the war leathers and the tusks and the iron-beaded braid with an expression that flickered between fear and disdain before settling into something falsely sweet. "I did not realize you had brought company." "She did not bring me," Yash said before Thomas could answer. "I go where I please." "Of course," Elsie said and touched Thomas's arm lightly, letting her fingers linger a moment too long. "Do think about that coat, Thomas." She swept away in a rustle of skirts, and Thomas turned to find Yash watching him with an expression that had gone flat and cold in a way he had not seen from her before, not even in the face of the old man who had spat at her boots. "She wants you," Yash said without preamble. "Elsie wants everyone to think she could have them if she wanted," Thomas said. "It is different from wanting. You did not pull your arm away. I did not think it mattered whether I did or not." Thomas turned to face her fully, surprised by the sharp edge in her voice, and something in him understood all at once exactly what he was hearing beneath the words. "Yash, are you jealous?" "Orcs do not feel jealousy over hired scouts," she said too quickly, and turned toward the cider stall with her shoulders set in a way that told him he had struck closer to true than she wanted to admit. He caught her wrist gently, the way he might have reached for something wild and easily spooked, and she let him, which told him more than anything she might have said aloud. "I did not want the coat," he said quietly. "I did not want her hand on my arm either. I have wanted exactly one person's company since the day I found her standing on a wagon covered in wolf's blood, and it is not Elsie." Yash looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face as though she expected to find a lie hidden somewhere in it and could not. "Careful human," she said finally, though her voice had gone soft. "A Fireblood woman does not share what she decides is hers." "Good," Thomas said. "I was never any good at being shared." He did not kiss her then, not with half of Millhaven watching, but the space between them had changed, and they both knew it, and they walked the rest of the fair together with her shoulder brushing his more often than the crowd alone could explain. The patrols continued through the turning of the leaves and into the first hard frosts, and with every week that passed Thomas learned more of her, and she of him, in the way that only shared danger and long silences on lonely roads can teach two people about each other. He learned that she was the only surviving daughter of Yash Fireblood, matriarch of the clan, and that she had been raised from childhood to lead war bands, trained with blade and bow before she had been old enough to braid her own hair properly. He learned that she had lost a brother to a rockslide on the high passes 5 years before, and that she still visited the cairn they had built for him every new moon, alone, and did not like to speak of it. He learned that she loved the sound the windmills made at night, a slow, patient creak that she said reminded her the world kept turning even when everything else felt broken. She learned, in turn, that he had buried both his parents before he turned 20, that he had no brothers or sisters, and that the cabin he lived in an hour outside of Millhaven had been built by his father's hands and had felt too big and too quiet for a decade. She learned that he did not fear the deep wild the way most men did, because the deep wild had never once looked at him like he did not belong, unlike the town below. She learned that he watched her sometimes, when he thought she was not looking, with an expression of open, unguarded wonder that no one had ever turned on her before, not once in 26 years of being feared and respected and occasionally hated, but never simply wanted for exactly what she was. One evening in early winter, camped in the shelter of an outcropping halfway up the plateau's northern face, sharing a single bowl of stew between them because supplies had run short, Yash finally asked him the question that had clearly been sitting behind her teeth for weeks. "Why do you do this?" she said, watching the firelight instead of him. "The town pays little. My clan trusts you less than it should. You could hunt anywhere in this territory and never come near either of us." Thomas considered the question honestly before he answered, turning the wooden spoon slowly in the bowl. "I spent 12 years alone in these mountains," he said. "Good years, mostly. I am not complaining. But there is a particular kind of quiet that settles into a man when he has no one waiting for him anywhere, no fire that is not the one he built himself. I did not know how loud that quiet had gotten until the day I saw you on that wagon." He looked up at her. "I do this because it is the first work I have done in a long time that feels like it matters to someone besides myself." Yash was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice had lost its usual edge entirely. "My people say a warrior who fights alone dies alone," she said. "I did not understand before why that frightened me. I do not fight alone when you are beside me, Thomas Lockhart. I had not realized how much I had come to depend on that until you asked why you were here." She reached across the small space between them and took the bowl from his hands, setting it aside in the snow, and then she took his face between both her palms, her thumbs rough with callus and gentle all the same, and kissed him. It was not a soft kiss. There was nothing soft in Yash Fireblood, not in the strength of her arms or the fierce certainty of her mouth against his, and Thomas met it with everything he had, one hand coming up to bury itself in the loose fall of hair that had escaped her braid, the other pulling her closer against the cold. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his and let out a low, rough laugh. "I have wanted to do that since the fair," she admitted. "Since before, if I am honest, since the wolves." "I would have let you do it a great deal sooner," Thomas said, "if you had asked." "Firebloods do not ask," she said, and kissed him again to prove it. Not everyone welcomed the change that had come over Yash Fireblood, and the man least pleased of all was Korgeth, a broad-shouldered warrior of the clan's second war band, whose father had spent years quietly angling for a match between his son and the matriarch's daughter. Korgeth was strong and proud, and not without his own kind of honor, but he had never once looked at Yash the way Thomas did, and he could not stomach seeing a human scout succeed where his years of posturing had failed. He confronted them both openly, 3 weeks after the kiss at the outcropping, on the open ground before the clan's hide tents with half the warband watching. "You shame your mother's line," Korgeth said to Yash, his voice carrying across the camp, "letting a human paw at you like a bitch in season. Have you forgotten what his kind did to your great-grandmother's people?" "I have forgotten nothing," Yash said, her voice gone dangerously flat. "I remember better than you, Korgeth, since it is my blood that carries the memory, not yours." "Then remember this too," Korgeth said, turning his glare on Thomas, who had not moved, had not reached for a weapon, had simply stood his ground with his chin level and his eyes steady. A human who beds a Fireblood daughter without the clan's blessing insults every warrior who has ever bled for this camp. "I have not asked for your blessing," Thomas said calmly, "because I did not know it was yours to give." Korgeth's hand went to the hilt of his axe, and for a moment the whole camp seemed to lean forward, breath held, waiting for violence to spill out across the frozen ground. But Yash stepped between them before it could, not cowering, not pleading, simply placing herself squarely in the space where a blow would have to pass through her first. "If you want to challenge someone, Korgeth," she said, "challenge me. I am the one who chose him. I will meet you blade to blade if that is what your pride requires, but you will not touch him." Korgeth stared at her for a long, tense moment, jealousy and shame, and something almost like grief warring visibly across his broad features, and then his hand fell away from the axe. "Your mother should hear of this," he said instead, and stalked off toward the matriarch's tent, and Thomas understood, watching him go, that whatever quiet tolerance the clan had extended to him so far was about to be tested in earnest. That night, lying beside the banked fire outside the tent she had been given for her own use, Yash traced the line of an old scar along Thomas's forearm with careful fingers, both of them wrapped in the same heavy fur against the cold. "He will not let this go," she said. "Korgeth's pride is a wound that never fully closes. I am not afraid of him. I know." She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him properly, moonlight silvering the strong line of her jaw, the small curve of her tusks. "That is not the same as saying you should not be careful. My mother is fair, Thomas, but she is also matriarch. If Korgeth brings this to her as a formal grievance, she cannot simply wave it away, not for me, not even for the daughter of her own body. The old laws exist for a reason. They have kept this clan alive through worse than jealous suitors." "What old laws?" Yash hesitated, and in that hesitation Thomas felt the first cold thread of something he did not yet understand settle into his stomach. "There is a debt," she said finally, "written into the treaty that lets your people and mine share this plateau at all. It was sealed in blood 3 generations ago, after a war that nearly ended both our peoples. Any human who wishes to be trusted deeply by this clan, who wishes to stand as more than a hired scout, must prove his heart is clean of that old betrayal. The clan calls it the trial of blood." "What kind of trial?" "A cut," Yash said, "from an old blade into a bowl that has held the blood of every chieftain since the accord was signed. If the man's heart is true, the wound heals clean within a day. If it is not—" She trailed off, her eyes going distant with old memory. "It has not always healed clean, Thomas. There was a man 2 generations back who lied about his loyalty and paid for it with a wound that blackened and would not close. He died within the week. My mother's mother told the story to frighten children into honesty. I did not think until tonight that I would ever fear it for someone I loved." Thomas absorbed this in silence, watching the windmills turn against the star-strewn sky in the distance, their slow creaking carried faint on the wind. "Then I will take the trial," he said, "if it comes to that. I have nothing to hide from any blade, old or new." "You do not understand," Yash said, and her voice had gone tight with a fear he had never heard in it before. "The blade does not simply test honesty, Thomas. It remembers whose betrayal made it necessary in the first place, and your family name is Lockhart." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. "What does that mean?" Thomas asked slowly. "It means," Yash said, "that the man who broke the original peace, who slaughtered my great-grandmother's envoys under a flag of truce and started the last true war between our peoples, was a human commander named Aldrich Lockhart. It means the blade was forged from grief over that betrayal. And I do not know if old iron can tell the difference between the blood of a man it hates and the blood of a man it should not." They sat in silence for a long while after that, the fire burning low, and Thomas found himself turning over a piece of family history he had never had reason to question before. A grandfather's name mentioned only rarely and always with a strange, careful distance, as though his own family had quietly agreed long ago never to speak of it too closely. "I did not choose my blood," he said finally, "any more than you chose yours. But I will not run from what my name might cost me, Yash, not if standing my ground is what it takes to stay beside you." "I am not ready to find out if it will cost you your life," she said, and there was something raw and unguarded in her voice that told him exactly how deep her fear ran, deeper than pride, deeper than clan law. "I have lost people to this land before. I will not lose you to an old grudge that was never yours to carry." He pulled her close then, and she let him, resting her head against his chest with a vulnerability she showed to no one else in the world. And outside the tent, the windmills kept turning, patient and indifferent to the fear tangled up between two hearts that had only just found each other. The matter of Korgeth's grievance was still unresolved, still sitting before the matriarch awaiting judgment, when the true danger arrived. And it arrived not from within the clan at all, but from the open grain roads that Thomas had sworn to protect. It happened on a bright, hard morning in early winter, the plateau dusted with the season's first true snow, the windmill's great sailcloth wings crusted white and creaking under the extra weight. Thomas and Yash were riding the northern patrol route together, as they had 100 times before, when they came around a stand of frost-heavy pines, and found the road blocked by wagons that did not belong there, and men who did not belong there either. Draven Vosk had been raiding the border country for 2 years, a bandit warlord with a small army of deserters and outlaws who had grown bold enough, in the hard winter months, to set his sights on the one prize that would let him control every grain shipment for 100 miles in any direction: the windmills themselves. There were perhaps 30 of them, armed with stolen blades and a handful of crude crossbows, and they had clearly been waiting, because the moment Thomas and Yash rode into view, arrows began to fly. "Down!" Thomas shouted, already hauling on his reins, but Yash was faster, throwing herself from her horse and rolling to her feet with both swords already drawn, meeting the first 2 bandits before they had even finished their charge. The fight that followed was chaos, blood and steel and screaming horses, and Thomas fought at her side as he always had, his knife finding throats, his bow put to work at close range between blows, the two of them moving together with the ease of long practice, each covering the gaps the other left open. It was going well, or as well as a fight against 30 men could go, until Vosk himself appeared at the tree line, a heavy crossbow already leveled and aimed not at Thomas, who was the nearer and easier target, but at Yash, whose head was turned away, occupied with a bandit swinging a rusted axe at her ribs. Thomas saw the crossbow rise. He saw Vosk's finger tighten on the trigger. He had time for exactly one thought, clear and absolute, and without a shred of hesitation in it. And then he was moving, throwing himself sideways and forward into the path of the bolt with every ounce of strength left in his body. The impact took him high in the chest, just below the collarbone, and the world went white and then very far away for a long moment. He was dimly aware of hitting the ground, of Yash's voice tearing itself raw with his name, of the fight around him somehow ending in a sudden violent flurry that he could not follow, blades flashing, men screaming, and then nothing but her face above him, streaked with blood that was not her own, her hands pressed hard against his chest. "Thomas. Thomas, look at me, do not you dare close your eyes, do not you dare." "I am not," he managed, though the words came out thin and strange. "I am looking. Did I get him?" "Vosk is dead," she said, and her voice cracked in a way he had never heard from her before, fierce warrior that she was, unshakable Yash Fireblood who feared nothing, weeping openly now with her hands slick with his blood. "You fool! You absolute fool, that bolt was meant for me. Why would you?" "Because I would rather die than watch it hit you," Thomas said, and then the world tipped sideways and went dark. He did not die. The bolt had missed anything vital by less than an inch, and Yash carried him the last 3 miles to the clan camp herself, on foot, refusing every offer of help from the surviving members of the patrol, her arms trembling with the effort long before she reached the healer's tent, and she did not leave his side for the 3 days it took the fever to break. When Thomas finally woke clear-headed on the 4th morning, weak but alive, the first thing he saw was Yash asleep in a chair pulled close beside his cot, her hand still wrapped around his, her proud face slack with exhaustion, and something in his chest ached with a tenderness so fierce it nearly stole what little breath he had. News of what he had done spread through the clan camp faster than the fever had spread through his blood. A human scout, throwing himself between a bandit's bolt and the matriarch's daughter, without hesitation, without a single thought for his own life. Even those who had distrusted him began to speak of it with something like grudging awe, and Korgeth himself, Thomas would later learn, had gone quiet and thoughtful in a way that suggested even his jealousy had been shaken by what he had witnessed. But all was not the same as acceptance, and the old fear that lived in the clan's collective memory could not be unmade by a single act of courage alone, especially once Yash Fireblood, going through the formal grievance Korgeth had lodged weeks before, uncovered the name buried in Thomas's family line. She came to the healer's tent herself on the 5th day, tall and grave in her matriarch's furs, and studied Thomas for a long moment before she spoke. "You bled for my daughter," she said. "The whole camp has spoken of little else. I do not forget such things, Thomas Lockhart, and I do not undervalue them." "Thank you," Thomas said carefully, sensing that more was coming. "But you carry the name of the man who murdered my grandmother's envoys under a flag of peace," Gara continued. "And the treaty that lets you walk on this plateau at all was written with a clause meant exactly for that name. I cannot simply set the old law aside because you are brave, or because my daughter loves you. If I did, every warrior in this clan who has ever lost family to the Lockhart betrayal would rightly call me weak, and a matriarch cannot afford to be seen as weak, not with Vosk's death already stirring other wolves to test our borders. You will stand for the trial of blood before the full clan, 3 days from now, once you have strength enough to stand at all. If your heart is as clean as your courage suggests, the blade will show it. If it is not—" She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Yash, who had been sitting silent through this entire exchange, rose to her feet with a fury barely contained. "Mother, you cannot ask this. He nearly died protecting me 3 days ago. Is that not proof enough of anything a blade could tell you?" "It is proof of his courage," Gara said, not unkindly but immovably. "It is not proof against 3 generations of old iron and older grief. The law exists because it has been needed before, Yash, you know this." "Then I will stand with him," Yash said. "I will not let him face that blade alone." "You cannot stand for another in the trial of blood," Gara said. "The law does not permit it." "Then find me a law that does," Yash said, her voice shaking with a passion Thomas had never once seen her show before her own mother. "Because I will not watch him bleed for a crime his ancestor committed 100 years before he was born, not after he bled for me without a single moment's hesitation." Gara studied her daughter for a long, searching moment, something complicated moving behind her dark eyes, before she finally spoke again, quieter now. "There is an old rite," she said slowly, nearly forgot, "that allows a daughter of the bloodline to offer her own blood in surety for another, staking her name and her honor against the outcome. It has not been invoked in 4 generations. It is not without its own danger, Yash. If you make this offer and the clan judges wrongly because of it, the shame falls on you and on our line, not on him." "I do not care about shame," Yash said. "I care about him living to see another sunrise." Gara held her daughter's gaze for a long moment, and something passed between them, mother to daughter, matriarch to warrior, that Thomas could not fully read but understood enough to feel his throat tighten with emotion. 3 days, Gara said finally. "Rest and heal what you can. We will see then what iron remembers and what love is willing to risk." The 3 days passed in a strange, suspended quiet, Thomas regaining his strength slowly, walking short distances around the camp with Yash's steady arm beneath his, both of them aware of the eyes that followed them everywhere, some curious, some still hostile, a few surprisingly sympathetic. Korgeth found them on the second evening, standing awkwardly at the edge of their fire with his hands loose at his sides, none of his usual bluster in evidence. "I did not think a human could throw himself in front of a bolt for anyone but himself," he said gruffly. "I have watched men of my own blood hesitate in less danger than that. Whatever happens at the trial, Lockhart, know that I withdraw my grievance. A man who bleeds like that for a woman does not deserve my jealousy. He has earned better than that from me." It was not friendship, not yet, but it was something, and Thomas thanked him with a simple nod that seemed to satisfy them both. On the third night, unable to sleep, Thomas found Yash sitting alone at the edge of the plateau, looking out over the dark fields toward the shapes of the windmills turning slow against the stars. "You are frightened," he said, settling beside her despite the ache still living in his shoulder. "I have fought raiders and wolves and men twice my size without my hands shaking," Yash said quietly. "I have never once feared a blade the way I fear this one. It is only iron, Thomas. It should not have this much power over me." "It is not the iron you fear," Thomas said. "It is losing me." She turned to look at him then, and in the moonlight he could see the truth of it written plain across her fierce, beautiful face, all her pride and strength laid bare for just a moment. "I did not know I could feel this frightened for another person," she admitted. "I have spent my whole life being the strongest thing in any room I entered. I do not know what to do with fear I cannot fight my way out of." "Then let me carry some of it," Thomas said, taking her hand, tracing the calluses across her palm with his thumb. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Yash, I do not regret a single day since the wolves. I would take that bolt again tomorrow if it meant one more season beside you." "Do not say things like that," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Not the night before I might have to watch that blade decide whether you live or die." "Then I will simply say I love you instead," Thomas said, "since that seems to trouble you less." Yash made a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob and kissed him fiercely, both hands fisted in the front of his shirt as though she could hold him there by sheer force of will, and they stayed like that a long while beneath the turning windmills, saying without words everything that words could not quite carry. The morning of the trial dawned clear and cold, the plateau's golden stubble fields white with frost, and by dusk the entire clan had gathered in the wide circle before the matriarch's tent, torches lit against the coming dark, the 7 windmills turning slow and steady at their backs as they had for 3 generations, silent witnesses to every joy and grief this land had ever held. This was the moment the whole camp had been waiting for, and Thomas knelt in the center of that circle with his wounded shoulder still stiff beneath his shirt, his palm turned upward, waiting for the ancient blade to decide his fate. Yash Fireblood stood before him with the oath blade balanced across both palms, its pitted iron dull in the torchlight, its history heavier than its weight. "You carry the name of the man who broke faith with my grandmother's grandmother," Yash said, exactly as she had said it before, the words that had opened this whole long telling now arriving again, this time with the whole weight of everything that had led to them behind her. "Blood remembers, Thomas Lockhart, even when men forget. Tonight the blade will ask your blood what your mouth cannot be trusted to answer." Thomas kept his eyes forward, his jaw set, refusing to let his fear show, though his heart was hammering hard enough that he was certain the whole circle could hear it. Then, before the blade could fall, Yash's hand closed around her mother's wrist. "No," she said, her voice carrying clear and unshaking across the entire gathered clan. Every head turned. Every conversation died. Yash stood tall beside her mother, her war leathers still faintly marked from the fight against Vosk's men, her eyes fixed not on the crowd but on the ancient blade itself, as though daring it to argue with her. "I invoke the old right," she said. "The right of a daughter of the bloodline to offer her own blood in surety for another. I stake my name, my honor, and my place in this clan's line on the truth of his heart. If the old iron must judge someone tonight, let it judge me." A murmur swept through the circle, shock and disbelief, and in some quarters outrage. An elder near the front, a grizzled warrior with a face full of old scars, stepped forward with a scowl. "The right exists," he said, "but it has not been invoked in 4 generations for good reason, Yash Fireblood. You would risk your own place in this clan for a human's blood." "I would risk far more than that," Yash said, "for a man who threw himself in front of a bandit's bolt without a heartbeat's hesitation to save my life at the cost of his own. I have fought beside him for a full turning of the seasons. I have seen his heart with my own eyes more clearly than any blade could show it to you. If you doubt him, doubt me instead. I am the one who chose him. Let my blood answer for that choice." Yash Fireblood looked at her daughter for a long, searching moment, the whole plateau holding its breath around them, torchlight flickering across 500 watching faces. "You understand what you are asking," Gara said quietly, though her voice still carried in the hush. "If the blade finds falseness in your offering, the shame and the consequence fall on you, not on him. You would carry that alone." "I understand," Yash said without hesitation. "I have never been more certain of anything." Gara held her daughter's gaze a moment longer, and something passed between them, some current of understanding that only a mother and daughter who had both buried grief on the same plateau could share. And then, slowly, the matriarch extended the oath blade toward her daughter instead of toward the kneeling man. "Then let it be done," Gara said. "The clan will witness." Yash took the blade herself before her mother could complete the cut, and in one swift, sure motion drew it across her own palm, opening a clean red line, and thrust her bleeding hand into the ceremonial bowl set at her mother's feet. Thomas, still kneeling, felt his heart lurch with a fear far sharper than anything he had felt for himself, and he was on his feet before he had quite decided to move, reaching for her. "Yash, stay back," she said, though her voice had gone tight with pain or perhaps something else. "This is mine to carry." The whole circle watched in absolute silence as the moment stretched out, the torches crackling, the windmills creaking their slow, patient rhythm in the distance, and Thomas realized he was holding his breath along with every other person gathered there, watching the blood pool dark in the ancient bowl, waiting to see what old iron and older grief would decide. Nothing happened. No blackening crept across her skin. No fever rose. The cut simply bled, clean and red and human, or rather, clean and red and true, exactly as any honest wound should. And after a long moment Yash withdrew her hand from the bowl and held it up for the whole clan to see, the cut already beginning, impossibly, to close at the edges, as though the old magic itself had recognized something true in what she offered and had no argument left to make. Yash Fireblood let out a breath that sounded, for just a moment, like relief rather than judgment. "The blade has answered," she said, loud enough now for the whole circle to hear. "My daughter's blood carries no falseness in this matter. She has staked her name on Thomas Lockhart's heart, and the old iron has found her honest." She turned to look at Thomas directly, something in her stern face softening for the first time since he had known her. "You will not need the trial, Thomas Lockhart. My daughter has spared you the blade, and in doing so has proven, more clearly than any cut on your own hand ever could, exactly how deep her loyalty to you runs. The clan honors her offering. The old debt, so far as it concerns you, is settled." A ragged cheer went up from somewhere in the crowd, quickly spreading, and Thomas felt his knees nearly give out beneath him, not from his old wound but from the sheer flood of relief crashing through him. He crossed the space to Yash in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, careful of her wounded hand, and she came without hesitation, burying her face against his shoulder, the fierce warrior who feared nothing finally letting the tears she had held back for days spill freely, safe within the circle of his arms. "You did not have to do that," he murmured against her hair. "You did not have to cut yourself for me." "I would cut myself 100 times over," Yash said, pulling back just enough to look at him, her dark eyes bright with tears and fierce, unshakable love. Before I would let that blade near you and wonder for even a moment whether old iron could tell the difference between your heart and your ancestors. I know your heart, Thomas Lockhart. I have known it since the day you put an arrow through a wolf's eye to save a woman you had never met. I did not need a blade to prove what I already knew. I needed only to spare you the risk of finding out otherwise. Around them, the clan had begun to relax into something like celebration. Torches passed hand to hand, someone striking up a low, rhythmic drumbeat, Korgath himself, of all people, raising his cup in a rough toast toward the couple still wrapped around each other in the center of the circle. Gara watched her daughter with an expression of profound, complicated pride, and when Yash finally looked up and caught her mother's eye, the matriarch gave a small, approving nod that said more than any speech could have. Thomas took Yash's wounded hand gently in both of his, careful of the cut already knitting closed at the edges, and pressed a kiss to her palm, right at the center of the wound she had opened for his sake. "I will spend the rest of my life," he said quietly just for her, "making certain you never regret what you offered here tonight." "I already know I will not," Yash said. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life, Thomas. Not even the day I killed my first wolf. Not even the day I became a warrior of this clan. You are the one thing I have chosen entirely for myself, and I am not sorry, and I will never be sorry, no matter what old iron or older grief might have tried to say otherwise." They did not leave the circle of firelight until well past midnight, the clan slowly dispersing into celebration and quiet conversation around them. Old prejudices not vanished entirely but visibly, undeniably shaken by what they had witnessed. Korgath approached once more before the night ended, offering Thomas a rough clasp of forearms, warrior to warrior, that needed no words to carry its meaning. Even the old scarred elder who had first objected found Thomas near the edge of the gathering and studied him for a long moment before speaking. "I have lived through this clan's memory of the Lockhart betrayal my whole life," the elder said. "I did not think I would live to see a Lockhart's blood, or the blood offered in his place, prove itself true before this whole camp. Whatever debt the old accord demanded of your name, Thomas Lockhart, I believe it has finally, truly been paid tonight." Thomas thanked him quietly, and when the elder had gone, he found Yash waiting a short distance away, her wounded hand already wrapped in a clean strip of cloth, watching him with an expression of such open tenderness that it stole the breath from his chest all over again. "Come," she said, holding out her uninjured hand. "There is somewhere I want to take you, before the night is fully spent." She led him away from the firelight, up along the northern rim of the plateau to where the oldest of the 7 windmills stood, the one the clan called First Sister, its great sailcloth wings turning slow and steady in the cold night wind. Exactly where, Thomas would later learn, the very first blood accord between the Fireblood clan and the human settlers had been sealed 3 generations before. It felt fitting, standing there with her beneath that ancient, patient structure, that the same ground which had once witnessed betrayal and grief should now witness something entirely different. "This is where it all began," Yash said, looking up at the great turning wings silhouetted against the stars. "The old peace, the old wound. I used to come here alone after my brother died and wonder whether anything good could ever truly grow from ground that had known so much old grief." She turned to look at him, her expression open and unguarded in a way she showed no one else. "I do not wonder any more, Thomas." "Neither do I," he said, and drew her close, and this time when they kissed there was no fear left in it at all, only the fierce, steady certainty of 2 people who had each, in their own way, thrown themselves between the other and disaster, and had found on the other side of that danger exactly the kind of belonging neither of them had dared to hope for. They stayed together on the plateau through that winter and into the spring that followed. Thomas's cabin traded for a life split between the clan camp and the deep wild trails he still loved to walk, though never alone anymore, never without Yash beside him or waiting for his return. The clan, slowly and imperfectly, the way real trust always grows, came to accept him not merely as a scout hired for his usefulness, but as a man who had bled in his own way for their daughter and their peace both, a man whose loyalty no longer needed proving because it had already unmistakably been shown. There was a small ceremony, some months later, held not with the full pomp of clan tradition but with quiet intention, in which Yash marked Thomas's forearm with a thin line of old orc pigment shaped like the turning blades of a windmill, a private symbol between them that meant, in the old clan tongue, chosen and kept. Thomas wore it without hesitation, and when Yash traced the fresh mark with gentle fingers that night, in the warm dark of the tent they now shared, he understood at last that the aching quiet he had carried for 12 solitary years in the mountains had finally, completely, been answered. On a warm evening in early summer, nearly a year to the day since he had first seen her standing atop a wrecked grain wagon with wolf's blood on her hands, Thomas found Yash again at the base of First Sister, watching the great windmill turn slow and gold against a setting sun, and he came to stand beside her the way he had 100 times since, wordless and certain. "Do you remember," she said without turning, "the night you told me the quiet in your cabin had gotten too loud to bear?" "I remember. Is it quiet now?" she asked, finally turning to look at him, her dark eyes soft with a love that had cost them both something real to earn. Thomas took her hand, the one that still bore the faint pale line of the scar she had chosen to carry for his sake, and pressed his lips to it exactly as he had that first night before the whole gathered clan. "No," he said. "It has never been quiet since the day I found you. It is full, Yash, full of you, and I would not trade that fullness for every silent season I ever spent before it." She smiled then, the rare, unguarded smile she gave no one else in the world, and pulled him close beneath the turning windmill. And there, on the Goldrun Plateau that had once demanded blood as the price of trust, they stood together, chosen and kept, exactly where they both at last belonged.